Yeah.
There he is.
Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone.
Evening, Father.
We are here where the Lord of Spirits going to start chapter 4 tonight. So let's start with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in the heavens, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, now and ever, and unto ages of ages. Amen. Okay, so chapter 4, Sacred Cosmology and Geography, which isn't really as much about cosmology as you might think from the title. Um, so are there any big questions before we get started, or that might help us enter into where you'd like to enter in on this? Or just all right. So I actually had to read through this poem here on page 79 several times to figure out how you even read it. So it's actually in 2 columns, um, even though it's not intuitive that that's the way it was set up. So the highlights are, the Lord made heaven for a roof, then middle earth, the forever Lord for men, for men the earth, heaven kingdom's guardian, um, and for men's sons the holy maker, mankind's guardian, fashioned after Master Almighty. That's not the whole poem, but that's the highlight. So it sets up in this one little poem, heaven and earth, right? And so his whole first point here in the first part of this chapter is there's heaven and earth, and that's kind of where we live, where we can imagine where the spirits live. And it starts with Genesis, right? So when God was beginning to create, the world was without form and void. And so God does those two things. He gives it order, gives it a structure, and then fills it up. Okay. And so when we read Genesis 1, we look at the first day about the creator and the heavens of the earth. And we look at day 4, and he's filling up the heaven and the earth, the sun and the moon and the stars. Okay. Now Genesis doesn't specifically mention when the angels are created. Some of the church fathers say that they were created on day 4 with the sun and the moon and the stars. Okay. Part of that reasoning is that the angels were given sort of territory to keep control of. And that's why they had to be created with the sun and the moon and the stars. Okay. When we get a little bit farther into the story of creation, then we get the creation of the nations. Then there's, guardian angels are pointed to the nations. But that comes later. Okay. So the whole thing is God gives structure and then he fills it up. Okay. So the question is, what are the heavens? Okay. So there's St. Paul talks about people getting caught up into the third heaven. I know a man who's caught up in the third heaven, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. And then there's talk about the seventh heaven, probably because there were 7 planets that the ancients could see with the naked eye. All right, the sun, the moon, and the 5 major planets, or 5 planets closest to the sun. And therefore, they thought that there must be a heaven for each one of those celestial objects. Okay. But that's never something defined. Okay. And so that's part of the whole problem here is the heaven that we talk about, the heavenly beings, the angels, aren't defined because they're not sort of scientific materialistically determined. Okay. So that's our big problem is we see everything as it's either matter or it doesn't exist. right? I mean, that's the atheist point of view. It's either matter, we can measure it, or it doesn't exist. But I said, well, what about love? Um, how do you measure love? How do you define that? How do you put that on a gram scale? You put on a weight scale?
We're talking about atheists. It doesn't exist.
Right. Well, so anyway, so there's a reality that that kind of experience just can't grasp. Okay. And that's what we're really talking about is this other reality. What are the heavens? Okay. Um, and so in the heavens and the earth, there are the spiritual beings and the human beings. Okay. That's what we inherit, or that's what we occupy. That's what we can see. Okay. So there, if you've read it, there was a big discussion about the birds of heaven, right? Talked about in Genesis, the birds of heaven being created. Well, we don't think of birds now as being in heaven, but that was part of the ancient worldview, right? That heaven is sort of everything above your head, um, and maybe even including your head, um, and that's the area where angels and demons exercise, do what they can do. Um, so we are not bound by the material world only. Okay. And so we reject anything that gives us a um, scientific materialist view that says only the things that we can measure exist, right? That's just not reality. Um, if you've never heard of God, if you've never read a life of any of the great saints, you could possibly come up with that just because you don't know no better. Um, but if you've ever had any kind of a spiritual experience, you know that there's something more than what you can measure. Okay? And so there's what Father Andrew here calls sort of the three-layer universe. There's us here on the human plane. There's the heavens, which includes the sky, but also outer space and also the stars and the moons. And, who knows how far away some of those quote stars are. Some of them are actually galaxies that we can see with the naked eye. And so they're hugely far away, but they're hugely large. So all of those things together make up this one area we call the heavens. And he gets to it later in the chapter about the underworld. Okay. Um, so sticking just with the heavens and the earth, um, it's where, um, so if you're old enough to remember um, the first Russian cosmonaut who, uh, circles the earth a couple of times and comes back down, he says, I was up in heaven and I didn't see God out there. And we're going, well, of course not, because you look at it with the scientific materialist eyeballs. Okay. You have no inner life to sense God. Okay. And that's what we try to do with our prayer life is we're trying to put ourselves in touch with the immaterial world in a good way. Okay. You pray to God, not to the demons, right? You pray to the demons and you end up being their servant rather than being God's servant. Yeah. Mhm. Um, but also notice that he takes a diversion here into the sky gods, Zeus and uh, Woden and all the others. And he lists several. Um, they don't have the same kind of um, sort of heavenly presence that God and the angels do, right? They're almost material beings, right? Um, they can sometimes take on material form. Zeus being the most famous of doing that, turns into several different kinds of animals, usually for the purpose of having relations with some kind of human maiden. Uh, Seems to be what they're always after. Um, they are Actually, not even angels, if they have any reality at all, they would be demons, right? Because they're diverting what may be true worship to themselves rather than to the true God. So to the extent think they do anything, they actually screw your life up more than it already is. Okay. Um, and so the trouble is, here in this world, people are equating the true God with Zeus and Woden and those guys. Okay. Our God never acts like those gods, right? He never takes on form of an animal or a human to go have sexual relations with another human being. That's just not the way God works. That's not what he's about. And so all of this stuff is the things that um, cause us to misinterpret what's really going on when we say the heavens. Um, there are um, um, uh, you know, the Hebrew expression, heaven of heaven or heavens of heavens, that is the place above the earth. We get this image from Genesis 1 that God separated the waters from the waters, and the waters that were above the earth be called the heavens, the waters below the earth he gathered into the sea and let dry land appear. So it gives you kind of a dome effect, that the heavens are up there and they go, circular. That's how we experience it, right? Um, but the earth is kind of flat, right? So it's the flat earth with the dome. And so he points out that that's actually how we experience the heavens and the earth. So for instance, we all know now that the earth goes around the sun and the earth spins on its axis, right? So technically, there's no such thing as the sun rising or the sun setting, right? That's just the function of the earth spinning around on its axis. The sun doesn't actually rise, the sun doesn't actually set. But it is still a real phenomenon from our point of view. And that's the big point he's making in. So from our phenomenological point of view, in other words, what we actually experience, we experience the sky as a dome because you go out there when it's a sunny day and you look up and yeah, that kind of looks like a dome, doesn't it? When you step out at night and see all the stars on a cloudless night, yeah, that looks like a dome to me. And so we shouldn't confuse a method of experience, the sun rises, the sun sets, the sky looks like a dome, with actual reality. So he points out that, the ancient Greeks actually did know that the earth was a sphere. They did know that the sun didn't really rise and set, but was caused by the earth's rotation. I mean, they knew those things. But yet that same culture came up with this idea of, the three layers, heaven, earth, and the underworld, because that's how they experienced their lives. And huge thing. How do we experience life? Well, that's what we're here all about. Some things are right in front of us, but some things we understand they exist, but we can't measure them. Okay? And that's when the modern world comes in and says, well, if you can't measure it and do an experiment and prove it, then it doesn't exist. And we say, no, that's just not true. So some people talked about some people act as if we live in a one-story universe, but we really live in a two-story universe. Okay, so there's the spiritual world is and this is only metaphor, on top of the sensual world that we experience. But again, those are all metaphors, okay? That you can't really talk about heaven without using a metaphor because we can't really experience, other than like 6 or 8 feet of it. Which kind of brings us to the Tower of Babel, though it's not really discussed in any depth here. So the ancient people didn't believe they could build a structure so tall that they could, quote, touch God or see God or whatever. That was just, it was always, they were building a temple. Essentially, they were building a ziggurat. Okay, so these ideas come from Mesopotamia. I mean, Babel is, I believe, early Babylonian for the gates of the god or gates of the gods. So, the gates of the god is the temple, not necessarily that you able to build it so high you could see God, right? That's not what they're really about. They were building a temple that they might go worship God, and by worshiping God, they thought they could control him. I mean, that's the whole pagan idea of God. If we create the statue, the votive statue for the God, we feed it, we dress it, we give it wine, then it will give us, a bountiful flock, sons and daughters around our table, victory over our enemies, all those kind of things. And what the Hebrew scripture comes in and says, well, you kind of got it all wrong, right? That you don't really get to control God, no matter who you think you are or how much you feed your God or whatever. Your God can't stand up. If he falls over, he can't pick himself up. And so there's several things in Hebrew scriptures that point out the fallacy of the pagan gods. The kind of the most dramatic one is one of the parts of the book of Daniel that is left out of the Masoretic text in the Protestant Old Testaments, where King Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel are having a discussion, and Nebuchadnezzar says, look at our God, he's real. He comes in every night and he eats all the food that's been offered to him that day. And so Daniel says, okay, well, we're gonna do an experiment here. So he sends everybody out except for him and the king. They load up the altar with all the food that's been sacrificed, and then they take flour and they dust the whole floor around the altar. And then they leave. And the king himself locks the door. No one's going to get in through the doors. And so they come in the next day. The king sees the altar and there's nothing left on it. And he's starting to crow, ha, Daniel, see. And then Daniel says, wait, don't take another step. Look at the floor. And look down at the floor, and there's all these footsteps of men, women, and children all around the whole area and around the altar. See, that's your priests. They're coming in somehow and eating all the sacrifices. There's no God here. So that's how we really think about everything that the quote gods, little g gods, do. Now there is a theory that I've heard very, very recently about the Tower of Babel, that what that actually is a sort of a metaphorical description of what's called the Bronze Age collapse. So in the 13 and 1200s BC, in that time frame, there was actually trade all across the Eastern Mediterranean into Mesopotamia. King Hammurabi, that we all heard about in grade school when we took world history for 5 minutes, about the Code of Hammurabi. He actually was fond of Cretan sandals. And so that tells us what? That Mesopotamia was trading with Crete. So bronze, it is easier to make than iron, or easier to smelt than iron, but it takes two different things, tin and copper. And they don't both appear in the same place in that part of the Middle East. So they were getting tin from Afghanistan and Turkey, but the copper came from Cyprus. And the original name, the original word that morphed into the name Cyprus meant copper. And so that you had to have trade to have bronze, because no one had everything you needed to create bronze. And so the Bronze Age collapse happens probably about 1100 BC, and that sets up the Sea People. So we think now that there was one of these huge volcanic eruptions right there in the Greece-Turkey area, that would make a year or two of years with no summer. So you didn't have enough warmth and sunlight to raise crops. So everybody got set in motion. Well, if I can't eat here, I got to go somewhere. Maybe over the next hill there will be something to eat. Okay, so we see that in the Egyptian records because they were invaded, but they were able to fight them off. Okay, and the Egyptian word kind of translates as sea peoples. The sea peoples have come. We think that's where the Philistines actually come from. They settle, where do they settle? They settle on the coast of Palestine, from Gaza, that's now in the news, all the way up to Lebanon and northern Lebanon. They came from somewhere, and they would have had to come from somewhere around the Aegean, maybe the Black Sea, all this area that would have been impacted by this volcano. And so what you get then is mass migrations, but also chaotic migrations. Rather than migrating as organized groups, you migrate as you can with a clan or a family group, or and you join in with other groups, and you fall apart and you join with different groups. So all that's going on, and that's what's the people couldn't understand each other anymore. There was no more organizations in any of these countries to provide translators. So if you're in Crete and you're trading with Mesopotamia, you got someone on staff that's gone and learned how to speak their language and come back. So he can translate for you when more traders come, and vice versa. Someone from Mesopotamia would have come to Crete and stayed with them long enough to learn Greek and go back and translate when the next Greek caravan comes over. All that gets broken apart with the Bronze Age collapse. Okay? And so the Iron Age comes when people say, we used to be able to make metal things that were way better than these bones and wooden sticks that we're making right now. And so they took the technology of creating bronze and essentially learned how to make a hotter fire so they could smelt iron ore. And iron ore shows up in very many places. You only have to have one source. You don't have to have that second metal to create iron ore. And that's when you get the Iron Age. It's not that people all of a sudden became smarter. It's just that they had to have something that they could create metal without having to trade.
Need better weapons.
Better weapons, of course. Got better hairpins. So all of that's going on, and that's actually leading up to what is the confusion of language? Well, you go through a couple hundred years of not having translators, not being able to trade, not being able to have your guys translate from these foreigners who just came with all kinds of trade goods. So in Greek history, it's called a Dark Age. So it's Agamemnon and all those guys that we read about in Homer's things were actually pre-destruction. And so Homer's like remembering the tales from what happened before. And we've now had this Dark Age, and Homer's actually the sort of the point where they're coming out of the Dark Age. Okay. We get that in the invasion of the Philistines in Judea. There's the old Babylonian Empire collapses, and there's new empires in that part of the world, and they start changing. That there's one empire, and then there's another empire, and there's a third empire, and they're all taking over the same area because of the chaos that's been created by this volcano. So that's the Earth that we all think of as, the Earth. He made the round world so sure that it shall not be moved, but it didn't say anything about not creating volcanoes. All right. Okay. All right. So anything about heaven or earth?
That tree on that song came out. That song came out. Round the world.
That would have been one of David's Psalms. So people date him different times, but roughly 800 BC.
Many of the words was around at that time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. A Greek.
It-
Um,
Father, did you say that that poem was supposed to be read by columns and not across?
yes. Yeah, back
It
here.
does make more sense when you read it the column way.
Yeah. Yeah, I tried to read it several times and I said, this is just not making sense. And then I read it in columns and said, okay, now I get it.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah, so it starts out, now shall we hail the might of the measurer, work of the Father glorious, the forever God. He first made heaven for a roof, then middle earth, the forever Lord, for men the earth, heaven's kingdom's guardian, and his mind's counsel, as wonders for each he founded their beginning. For men's sons, the holy maker, mankind's guardian, fashioned after Master Almighty. Okay. So that last part, fashioned after Master Almighty, we're made in God's image and likeness. So if you notice that this poem was it's one of the oldest things in Old Middle English. So, certainly they didn't have punctuation like we do. And their forms of, they wouldn't have had clear cut, adjectives, adverbs like we do, that many older languages, you kind of get subjects and verbs together in one word. So, if that wasn't translated, we would not be able to understand a thing that was in that poem. Okay. All right. So let's move on to the underworld. Okay. So the underworld is the abyss. It's the ocean. That even today, while we can control some things on the ocean, we can certainly pollute it pretty well. But when a hurricane comes, there ain't nothing we can do about that. I mean, it's just going to do what it's going to do, and the best you can do is get out of the way. The ocean is still a very powerful. I don't know what's the word? Substance, event, place. It's got a mind of its own, and that's connected with the underworld. Okay. So the underworld has always been thought to be someplace under the earth. And originally they would have things like, there's got to be caves or something that you can go down. And so the Aeneid has places like that. I believe the Odyssey has a scene like that where Odysseus goes down to talk to his father in the underworld. But we have just like we have no illusions that, you can find God somewhere up in space, we know that you can't find hell down in the earth. Okay. We've at least sort of scanned all the earth, figured out that we can't really drill that deep into it, or it just becomes impossible to go further. But we know that there's no cavern or something down there that's got all dead souls in it. It's not a material thing, just like heaven's not really a material thing. Now the sky's a material thing. The heavens, in the sense of that's where the planets are and that's where all the stars are, that's a real material thing. But the heavens, which is where the spiritual beings live, just isn't encompassed by the material reality only. It's more like the other way around. The material world is a little part of the spiritual heaven, but the material heavens doesn't encompass all of the spiritual heaven. So the sort of the spiritual underworld doesn't include all of any part of the material world. We certainly don't believe that we'll ever, quote, drill down to the center of the earth and find Hades. Okay. Just not what it is. Okay. But he does bring up the prophet Jonah. And so we all have a image in our minds that's sort of like Pinocchio and Geppetto in the sea monster and the whale in that Disney movie, right? That's our image when we talk about Jonah going in and being swallowed by the big fish, right? But listen to this. This is chapter 2 um, of the book of Jonah. Now the Lord commanded a huge creature to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of this sea creature 3 days and 3 nights. In the belly of the sea creature, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God and said, I cried out in my affliction to the Lord my God, and he heard my voice. Out of the belly of Hades, he heard the voice of my cry. Well, what's the belly of Hades? It's not inside a fish, right? It's where dead people go. That's what Hades is. Okay? So Jonah's already telling us, I'm in Hades. I'm dead. Okay. You cast me to the depths of the hearts of the sea. All rivers encompass me. All your surging waters and waves passed over me. And I said, I've been driven away from your sight. Shall I again look with favor toward your holy temple? Water is poured over me to my soul. Okay? The lowest depth encircles me. My head plunged into the clefts of the mountains. I descended into the earth, the bars of which are everlasting barriers. Okay, so that reminds us of Pascha when we talk about Christ breaking down the bars of Hades, right? Again, that comes from Jonah here. You let my life ascend from corruption, O my Lord and my God. When my soul was failing from me, I remembered the Lord. May my prayer be brought to you into your holy temple. Those who follow vanity and lies forsake their own mercy, but with a voice of thanksgiving and praise, I will sacrifice to you. As much as I vowed, I shall offer to you, the Lord of deliverance. Then the Lord commanded the sea creature, and it cast up Jonah on the dry land. So, the water poured over me. That's what Father Andrew is here saying in this book, that the ocean, the abyss, you get down to the water and you don't survive. Like we just lost 2 seals here off the coast of Yemen in the last couple of days. One guy falls in, the other guy goes to save him, and they both drown. At least that's what we think right now. The sea is a very dangerous place when water's poured over your soul. I mean, that's not just like you're struggling for breath. It's like you're dead, right? The water's over your soul, you're dead. You're in the abyss. Okay. And so when we understand that Jonah's talking about dying, then we know why Christ says, you will look for a sign, but they'll be given no sign to you but the sign of Jonah. Well, what are we supposed to make from that? That Jesus is going to go flop in a whale's stomach for 3 days? Or we know that Jesus is going to die and go into Hades. So that's the underworld. That's where dead people go, okay? And to carry it further, the reason why Jesus died on the cross for us is that only dead people go to Hades, right? So that's the place of dead people. Jesus had to become a dead person to go into Hades and break the bars of Hades and lead us all out of it. That's the magic of Pascha. Jesus goes where dead people go and brings us up out of it. So if you've ever looked at that icon of the resurrection, Jesus is standing in glory. He's always shown in white, and he grabs Adam. Right? Adam doesn't grab hold of Christ's hand and help himself up. No, Jesus comes. Jesus is doing all the lifting, and sometimes you'll see Adam being lifted up, and the parade of saints following behind him, being lifted up like a big string or a big rope. Okay, and that's Jesus is doing. That's what he's doing in Hades, between being entombed on Friday night and resurrecting on Pascha morning. That's where Jesus is. And that whole event is called the harrowing of Hades. Okay? It's the Jesus overcoming death for us men and for our salvation. So there's nothing about punishment. I mean, the cross is not, from God's point of view, there's no punishment in the cross. The Jews and the Romans thought they were punishing Jesus, but that's not God's plan, right? The wisdom of Solomon, the people thought that they were causing a great mischief, but the righteous are in the hands of God. So certainly that would include Jesus. God's protecting him. God's doing those things. And Jesus is breaking the bonds of Hades from the inside, which is why usually we have an icon of the resurrection. At the very bottom center, there'll be a fairly dark place, and there'll be like little keys and broken locks and pieces of chain down in that dark part. That's because that's representing Jesus breaking down the bars of Hades, the things that keep us jailed down there, that keeps our souls in prison until he comes. So that's what's going on there. And that's the underworld. And our best way of trying to understand it is the abyss, okay? The deep sea, Father Andrew points out the Marianas Trench, the deepest place on earth, that we have never been able to get down into it really, to tell what's going on down there. I mean, there could be alien creatures of all kinds that we just don't know about because they're down there and they're staying. And then the pressures are so great that they probably can't take the lighter pressures of the ocean part that we can get into. But that's the metaphor, if we go down into the Marianas Trench, we're dying. When we go down into the abyss, into Hades, we're dying. We're dead. It's a one-way trip until Jesus comes. And that's the three layers of the spiritual universe. The heavens, more than just the planets. The earth, more than just what we can measure. And then the underworld, places where dead people go. And Jesus is in all three of those places, feeling all things, thyself uncircumscribed, as the prayer goes. So that is the universe that the angels and the demons and the humans interact in. And there's, obviously being in heaven with the angels is better than being in Hades with the demons, okay? But notice none of that said anything about hell, right? So hell itself, we get from Matthew's gospel that it was created for the devil and his angels. It's not created for men. Men have to choose to go to hell. God sends no one to hell. We have to choose to go there on our own. How do we choose to do that? When we say, God, well, I don't want you. If you're that God, I don't want you in my life. That's how you go to hell. And that's where it is. It's the abyss. It's so deep, you'll never come out. But you have to choose to go there. God doesn't, why does God send people to hell? God never sends anybody to hell. People choose to go to hell. They see God and they say, I don't want any part of that. And there they go. So, a different, completely different metaphor about what happens after we die is that we're in the presence of God and God's love. But if you think that God's love is a bad thing, or you don't want God's love, or you hate God's love, then God's love will be like a burning fire. So maybe some of us, when we were young, we were like infatuated with someone of the opposite sex, or someone of the opposite sex was infatuated with us, but there was no mutual attraction. So the one that is so infatuated that what they think of as their love just becomes a burning passion. And that's what it's like if you're in God's love and you don't want it. It becomes like a burning passion that overcomes your existence. That's hell. Okay. Mind's blown. All right. I think that's good enough for chapter 3. So next week, we will not be here. So it'll be 2 weeks before we get back together. Gives you time to get caught up or reread chapter 5. If you had an opportunity to
What, on Genesis?
no, that'll be a while. That'll be a while. Okay. Anything from anybody online?
Everything, honey?
No, no.
All right. Lord, now, okay, Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace. According to thy word, for mine eyes have seen thy salvation, which thou hast prepared before the face of all people, a light to lighten the Gentile and the glory of thy people Israel. Go in peace in the name of the Lord. Good night,
Father.
everyone.
Thank you, Father.
Night, Father.